The Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. We're here to explore principles that shape the way we lead and work and build businesses with purpose. I'm Steven Skash, joined by my co-host, Mike Lusky, and our special guest. And today's conversation is one that kind of challenges conventional thinking about leadership and the workplace. Love in the workplace, what does that really mean? And how does it connect to the way we evolve as conscious beings? And at the core of that discussion is the idea that of businesses and leadership structures that aren't just economic engines, but they're living systems. And I know I've mentioned this a few times on the show, and I'm going to love diving into this topic today. But these systems kind of reflect something deeper about our nature, about purpose, about our ability to collaborate, to thrive, and create meaningful impact. Mike, introduce our guest today.
All right. Excited to do that, Stephen. It's a great topic. I know that our followers and our listeners are keenly interested in this discussion. So with us today, our guest is David Sloan Wilson. He's a scientist, a biologist, and a distinguished thought leader who's spent decades studying human cooperation, cultural evolution, and dynamics of groups. Now, David is also the co-founder of ProSocial World. It's an organization dedicated to applying science to real-world challenges. On top of that, he's also the author of several books that bridge the worlds of science, business, and social transformation, really intended to help leaders rethink how organizations function more as ecosystems of collaborations of purpose. We're super excited to have you today with us, David. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. I've only been newly introduced to your show, and it's awesome. I've loved the podcast that I've heard, and I was introduced to you by Chris Jarvis, who recently did an episode with you. So here's a shout out to Chris. And I might be mentioning him in our own conversation.
That'd be great. And for our listeners that haven't really seen that episode, you can go back and see what David's talking about. But yeah, that was a very good discussion. So David, maybe before we just sort of dive in, let's start off with just maybe like a bigger question. When we talk about love in the workplace, what does that actually mean?
So I want to introduce the word prosocial right up front, which is anything oriented towards the welfare of others or your group as a whole. And so we can see love as a very strong form of prosociality, in which you become so attached to something that you value it as much or even more than yourself, that you'll do anything for what you love. And so the question, love in the workplace, is whether that kind of intense prosocial emotion and action can actually take place in a workplace where we could love our workplace, love our fellow workers, love what the business does. That's what love in the workplace means.
Yeah, excellent.
That's well
I think so often like leadership is framed in terms of strategy and power or efficiency, but if we step back and we look at business kind of as a living system, what changes in how we approach leadership?
Well, if we think of what an organism is, it's a unit that is almost entirely cooperative. All of the organs in an organism work on behalf of the whole. And the more cooperative a business gets, then the more it invites comparison with being a single organism. And sometimes that imagery is used, especially in religious groups. But so an organism and a workplace as an organism is basically a workplace as a highly, highly cooperative unit in which all of the parts are coordinated with each other. And of course, we want all businesses to be cooperative. And I think this kind of gets to the root when we talk about such things as competition and cooperation, and especially the role that competition plays in a business. Then we have to ask these questions at a fundamental level. And that's where my biological training comes in handy.
Yeah, and organisms, they have to be healthy, right? Or if one part of them is a little bit off, then it can affect the whole in
And
there.
cancer basically are cells that are, you could call them selfish or cheating cells, where they proliferate at the expense of the economy of the whole body. And so cancer is an example of selfishness taking place within biological organisms. And we have to be vigilant about that kind of disruptive selfishness taking place within organizations. It's one of the great problems, is how do we prevent disruptive forms of self-interest to um, um, take place in the workplace.
Yeah, in the past, I've used an example of we were talking about the kelp beds here on the west coast of the U.S. and how we've hunted the sea otters out of kind of existence in there, and then suddenly the starfish population collapsed, and now all we have is all these urchins just eating up the kelp beds, and it's disrupting everything. And these urchins, when they're done doing that, they go into this zombie mode where they just stay and wait. And so we were kind of equating this as business problems, that sometimes if you just aren't addressing them in your organism or your living system business, they're just waiting there to have a problem at some later date to cause you problems. So I feel like that's one of those examples there of how you kind of have balance of some type, where it's healthy versus, like you said, this sort of selfish interest, or one interest that's overriding. So one stakeholder in this system would be the urchins, and now they're the only one dominating that. And you might be able to equate that to maybe like the investor relationship of a stakeholder in a business being a little out of balance versus taking a multi-stakeholder approach.
Well, there's this myth that if you look, just everyone pursue their separate self-interests. Individuals pursue their self-interest, corporations pursue their self-interest, and then some kind of invisible hand is supposed to come in and make that turn out right for the whole system. Well, I'm sorry, that just ain't so. And too bad is the dominant metaphor of business life. Competition is not like that. Competition so often is destructive, and it's not that competition is bad, but it just has to be applied in an intelligent way. And at that point, you can get basically competition working in favor of cooperation rather than against it. So it's really not hard, but it does require a bit of a paradigm shift in how we think about such things as competition and so on.
For sure. Now, David, one of the ideas that fascinates me is when we create these workplaces that are based around love and cooperation, for our listeners out there that are business leaders, we actually see higher engagement, better decision making, and more innovation, right? Because there's this higher level of trust. So, David, like your work has helped shift the way we think about organizations, not as some these rigid machines or this authoritarian style of a place. So it was interesting. I actually read a study by McKinsey in preparation for this podcast, and it brought out that the organizations that are adaptive, right, that are interconnected, are actually 6.5 times more likely to outperform their competitors, both in profitability and I think also in the amount of innovation that they bring. But so with studies like that, with statistics like that available to us, leaders still seem a little hesitant to embrace these ideas. I'm kind of curious, maybe like why do you think that might be?
Well, one of my favorite articles is a Harvard Business Review article by Jeffrey Pfeffer and Robert Sutton called Evidence-Based Management. And they begin by talking about evidence-based medicine. And they say, well, you might think that medicine is evidence-based. Of course it is. But actually, no. And studies show that, only about 15% of medical practice is evidence-based. And what doctors really do is they base on experience, what works, what they've been trained to do, especially what they're being sold by vendors. And so medicine needs to be evidence-based. Too bad that it's not more so. And then management even worse. Management even worse. And so much of what takes place in a business is not evidence-based and should be. So if it was evidence-based, then the kind of statistic that you cite, which more or less reveal the benefits of highly cooperative businesses, then it would. But there's so much evidence that shows that that's not the case. And instead, people are guided by their narratives. And the narrative, the dominant narrative of basically greed is good, the shareholder value model, all of that, which basically means that just about everyone you invite on your show is swimming against that wind, swimming against that tide. And so the narrative is guiding expectations, kind of informing what you should be doing. And it's not working, but because it's not evidence-based, people just continue doing it. And then the great companies that you profile appear like some weird outliers, when in fact,
I know.
it's what everyone should be doing. It's amazing.
I was thinking about that yesterday. I'm like, I know so many people, like so many of my friends and stuff, who are just kind of miserable at work and for all these different reasons. And I'm like, and every week I get to invite these really great companies on the show, but it's not like, it's like you said, it's the outliers. These are the outliers, but they are proving you can be successful, highly successful. You can own massive franchises and things like that with this kind of approach. But I do know it's like, it's a little bit of a bubble, or maybe a little bit of a happy place sometimes, but it's like an example. We just want to keep showing examples of how this can be done, because like you said, like there's evidence out there, and it's like, do we just need to keep showing the evidence again and again, or when is the change going to happen where it just takes place with a lot more leaders that this is the way to go?
Well, there's evidence out there and there's theory out there. And we need the evidence plus the theory. I'll get to the theory in a minute, but in the absence of theory, what you have is you'll have like thousands of examples that have all converged on the same place from different directions. Every story is different. And when you go and you ask, how did you come by this, wonderful cooperative thing that you do? Every story is different. And typically, every story is unknown by other people, or it might have some small circle of fame. Some small circle of people might know about it, but beyond that small circle, nobody knows about it. And so that's not good enough. What there needs to be is some compelling reason that explains why is it that, or what are the ingredients that enable cooperation to thrive. And that's where a new theory needs to come in. And that's what I think, what evolution and complex systems theory and a lot of newfangled ideas are basically capable of coming in and providing theory to explain the evidence. That's what's needed. That's what I'm quite passionate about.
Yeah. So what concepts would you say are kind of at the heart of creating a living business system? Is it like love, compassion, empathy? Is it purpose? Is it a combination of both? What general concepts would you say are key to that?
We're going to get to leadership in a minute, but I think the most important thing to notice is the fact that love and prosociality and anything that involves extending yourself to others is vulnerable. It's fragile. It's very likely to be exploited by people who are more self-serving. And so unless you provide a safe and secure, trusting social environment that makes it safe to be loving, safe to be pro-social, then sensible people will just turn it off. And they should. I think one of the great problems is that when we encourage people to be loving and pro-social and empathic and so on, we're really setting them up for failure unless we actually provide the environment that protects them against exploitative behaviors. And so there's kind of rules and regulations that are needed by a group in order to create this safe and secure social environment. And when you provide them, which is exactly what these companies have done, that's what they've done again and again and again, without necessarily, theorizing about it. So that if you just imagine in these companies somebody not behaving pro-socially, well, it's not going to work well for them. There will be protections against that. And so there's a structure that's required in order for love and pro-sociality to.
Let's talk about that a little bit. How do we build conscious companies? What's the the structure, and where do you think we should start?
Well, there's a key figure here, and I'm going to name her, and then I'm going to ask if she's already familiar to you. Her name is Elinor Ostrom. Are you familiar with her at all?
I've heard the name for sure. She wrote, is it a purpose-related book? Or am I off?
You're off.
She's not familiar to me, no.
No, I'm saying that not to shame you. Believe me, I'm saying it not to shame you, but I am making an important point, which is this point that I often use the metaphor of an archipelago, that there's a vast archipelago of thought and practice with little communication among islands. And so any one of your guests is going to be on one of these islands, going to be famous within that island. It's going to be unknown beyond that island. And that's the way Elinor Ostrom is. She's famous for some people and unknown to most others. And so I think this is a wonderful illustration of that fact. Now I'll introduce her, because she's the person who actually identified the design feature, what she called core design principles for a loving organization. And so very, very briefly, she was a political scientist, and she studied the tragedy of the commons. That's what happens when a group is drawing upon a common pool resource, like forests or pastures or fisheries or irrigation water. And there's always a temptation to take more than your share. And so when too many people take more than their share, then there's the tragedy of overuse. And what she showed by studying these groups is that actually some of them are capable of managing their own affairs. They can self-manage their resources. And the way they were designed, she explained basically how they were designed. And then I worked with her, and I showed that these design features, which I'm about to describe, are needed by all cooperative groups. All cooperative groups need these core design features. And if you look at the groups that are successful at being highly cooperative, they've all converged upon these core design principles. And for that, she won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. So she's famous, and to a degree, but that doesn't mean that everyone knows about her, as we have seen. So I'll take a breath. And anything you'd like to say before I launch into the core design principles?
No, let's launch into the. I assume, like a lot of these companies have kind of one way or another, just sort of through trial and error, found these principles.
Yeah. In fact, I have my own podcast, and I've done many podcasts with companies. One in particular, I'll spend more time on. And that's what happens. That if they've really become cooperative, and then you live, and none of them have heard of Elinor Ostrom, so you're in good company. But when you list the core design principles, then you say, "Is this how you work?" And they say, "You bet it is." And often the way they've arrived at these principles is ingenious, and so you learn so much about how they did it that it's just wonderful in each and every case to find and explore this great fit. So shall I list the core design principles?
Let's get into it. So it just kind of reinforces the truth of what she's saying, is that they've come at it their own ways, and they've all sort of coalesced around these what did you say, 7 concepts? Is that the
eight core design principles? And of course, she didn't invent them. She discovered them in this certain kind of group, these common pool resource groups. So she didn't invent them. And so you're exactly right. Basically, the and of course many groups don't have them, and that's why there's variation. So if you look at any kind of group, including business groups, and you see how well do they perform as groups, they vary. There's a bell-shaped curve, and there's the one end of high performers, another end of total catastrophes, and then most of our groups are muddling along in the middle. So every group can benefit from knowing about these core design principles and can climb that up that distribution. All right, you ready?
Yep, let's hit them.
Yeah.
All right. And when I do this, I often say, first of all, think of a group that you know well. Let it be a workplace group. And I don't care how well it works, well or poorly, just fix it in your mind. And then ask yourself the question, does this group that you know well, how well does it implement these core design principles? And how well does it perform? Number one, a strong sense of identity and purpose. The group has to be well defined as a group. It needs to be a meaningful group. We need to know who's a member. And so this basically defines the group as one which has a strong sense of identity and purpose. You know that you're a member of this group, and you know that it's meaningful. Number two, benefits proportional to cost, not sustainable for some members of the group to get the benefits and for other members of the group to do all the work. Naturally, that's not going to work very well. There has to be some sense in which what you get from the group is proportionate to what you give. Number three, inclusive decision-making, not sustainable for some members of the group to call the shots that influence other members of the group. In the first place, that's a recipe for unfairness. And in the second place, it does not make use of the wisdom of everyone in the group. Number four, monitoring agreed upon behavior. We need to know what we've agreed upon to do and if we're doing it. Number five, graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behavior. If we're not doing what we should, there needs to be correction for it, but it need not start out nasty or mean. It should start out friendly and only escalate as needed. And as we're correcting unhelpful behavior, we need to richly reward helpful behavior. If you're doing what you should be praised for it, and you should be materially compensated for it. And in some of the most successful companies, they talk about a 5-to-1 ratio, 5 units of praise for every unit of criticism. Number six, fast and fair conflict resolution. Conflicts will occur and they need to be resolved quickly and in a manner that's regarded as fair by both parties. Number seven, authority to self-govern. The group has to have elbow room to do the job as they see fit. And number eight, appropriate relations with other groups. So embodying the same principles. And so these same principles are needed for between group interactions in addition to within group interactions. And so we have the first one defines the group. The 2 through 6 regulate the group. And 7 through 8 govern between group relations. So there you have it. And you can imagine that in a group that implements these principles, it's hard to be a bastard. It's hard to be a bully.
We've talked about this these different elements in various forms. Like you said, it's like one way or another, we talk about like the self-managed principles. We've talked about, I think our first podcast was on resentment. So it's like conflict resolution quickly and, and of course, we've been developing our marketing, and our approach to it is really highly centered around companies defining a clear vision and purpose for
that's number one. I mean, if you don't have that, then now we've done research that compares business groups with other kinds of groups, and what we've shown is that on average, business groups are deficient in all 8 of these core design principles. On average, they vary too, and we have a spectacular example of businesses that implement these core design principles, as we know. But on average, business groups, our research shows, is deficient in all of them, with the biggest deficits being local autonomy. So many people can't do their jobs as they see fit. Decision making. Many people do not take part in the decisions that affect them in their jobs. And of course, a strong sense of meaning and purpose. Many people don't find that their work is very meaningful. Those are the three biggest deficits in the workplace. So isn't that amazing? And you really want to know, how is it possible for business groups where, most economic activity, all economic activity takes place, should be that misinformed, so that they score on average low on every single core design principle that's needed to make a group work well. There's an average deficit in business groups. Just think about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe because they were told that the purpose of business is the sole pursuit is profit, and everything else can go to hell, basically.
Exactly. They're basically they have this myth that they're following, and that's exactly the main reason. And so what that means is that if you can dispel that myth, which you can, and then you have something that's closer to the truth, then now you have the theory to back up the evidence. At this point, that not only do you have these wonderful examples, but they make perfect sense. They make perfect sense. And then people can see that, we all need to do this, and we can set about doing it. So this makes me very optimistic, really, that the improvement that's possible simply by a sea change of ideas.
Yeah, so I think, so where we usually end up talking about a lot of times is to get some of these ideas to happen is you kind of have to focus on the leadership, right? So what does it look like when a leader truly embodies, love and compassion and cooperation and service to his employees? What does that look like to have someone that can implement these kind of approaches to business?
I think we need to begin by examining the very concept of leader. And especially in the business world, I think implicitly, if we were to explore what comes to mind when we talk about leadership in the business world, and often what we talk about, what comes to mind is an extreme power imbalance. And so the leader is someone who has a lot of power over the organization. We hope they use that power well, but they do have that power. And I think that often becomes so behaving well becomes discretionary. And I think that is one of the things that needs to be questioned about leadership, is that there needs to be what you might say bottom-up control in addition to top-down control. And often you do need leadership in terms of just coordinating action. And, there's lots of reasons to have leaders, but that leader has to be very highly accountable. Part of the governance system cannot be a dictator, or otherwise that's just part of the problem. And what they need to do is they need to moderate activity. In many ways, they have to coordinate activity. And so their subordination is often referred to, for example, a servant leader, I think is a great two words to put together, because on the one hand, we have leader, but on the other hand, we have servant, a leader who serves. And so I think that is that's the form of leadership that we need to strive for.
That's a good point. I think too, David, we may have a question here from the audience. It was sourced from the audience. It says, David, can love be measured in the workplace, or is it something that we just end up feeling?
Oh, it can be measured in the workplace for sure. And in fact, Chris's Jarvis's episode, he said something which I disagree with, if I understand him correctly, which is only individuals can love. Groups can't love. Corporations can't love. Only individuals can love. I disagree with that. And I think as part of thinking of groups as organisms, then as organisms, they're capable of love. And maybe I can describe this one outstanding company as an example of that. It's a manufacturing firm called Barry Waymiller in the Midwest. It's profiled, it's one of the showcase conscious capitalism companies. And so no doubt you know about the conscious capitalism movement, and Raj Sisodia is one of the main spokespersons for that. And he has a book called Everybody Matters with the CEO of Barry Waymiller named Bob Chapman. And so this is are you familiar with this company, by the way, before I go on?
What's the company name?
Barry Waymiller.
You know what? I don't think I am.
Yeah, well, that's another my
right.
archipelago.
And I've read, the conscious capitalism and firms of endearment, and Raj's books there. But yeah, this one is not sticking with me if it was in any of this. But
yeah, and again, I'm not shaming you. I'm just illustrating
I know.
the archipelago phenomenon. So this is a manufacturing firm that makes stuff. It makes the machines that make toilet paper and cardboard boxes and things like that. So you might say that it does not have a noble purpose, and that by itself would be hard if you worked for a company like this to find much meaning in making a machine that makes toilet paper, for example. But we're about to learn otherwise. And Bob, as he tells the story, had a series of revelations. And so he's a Christian gentleman, and he takes his religion seriously. And he said before his revelations, he was a good guy. He ran a good company, but he still saw his employees as someone who was just, making just in the context of his business. But through these revelations, I wish I had more time to describe them, but he ended up with just a genuinely caring company. And they ended up, I have two podcasts with him and his senior staff. So this, our audience can go to those podcasts to learn the details. But this company treats its employees in the same way that a parent treats his or her children. And in fact, one of his revelations was that he was at a wedding. And so, two people were getting married, and they were the precious childs of their parents. And Bob's revelation was, that's how we should be treating all of our employees. And he created such a loving social environment. I think we can call a social environment loving, including a business environment, when it truly cares for its people. Why wouldn't we call that loving? And the people respond by, the employees respond by loving the company back. And so you get all the loyalty that you could ever ask for. But what's truly amazing about the story is that having done this for themselves, they have proceeded to acquire over 140 other companies and transform all of that as well. And we're working with them to document that scientific companies around the world.
I know who you're talking about now, that you bringing up that story, because I remember him mentioning, I think he was the one who mentioned that, going to church, you go for like 1 hour a week. And I've got people there. Revelations. Yeah, I've got people there for 40 hours a week that I can really impact their lives, which I'm all, yeah, exactly. I mean, that you've got a lot of influence on people in a positive way. So yeah, that was him. So yeah, no, I know you're talking about. Sorry,
and it doesn't matter that, and so these companies are around the world. And in my podcast with them, I said, you can't tell me that you could go into China and Korea or Bulgaria or Italy or France or all of these, and the same thing works. And he says, yes, I can. And I do, because what we're offering basically is this caring attitude. You get such things as, people from these companies breaking into tears and saying, And this is the first time that anyone's asked me for what I think. And this is the first time that I wasn't just treated as property by the company. Everyone is starving for this kind of respect and consideration, and that's what he's offered. Who wouldn't want something like that? So I think that this is so unusual in the business place is once again due to this myth that we're all walking around with. And as soon as you remove that myth, it becomes extremely commonsensical that if you build a social environment that's loving, it gets loved back. And those groups do very, very well.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that. Dave, we're getting close to the end of our show. We've got so much still to discuss.
Can we do like a couple hours here?
Yeah, exactly. We could keep
feel like
talking
we're
about
just
this
barely
for a long time.
Yeah, go for it.
Happy to do part 2 if you do that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think maybe we should, but I was sort of curious, maybe before we do wrap up, you've given us the 8 core principles, starting specifically with purpose, right? And having like a sense of self and meaning. But my question was going to be is, I guess when it comes to something that's practical for our followers, what would you say is either the first step? Is it developing that purpose? I don't want to answer the question for you, but I would say, could you give them some practical steps to maybe, start infusing some of this into their organizations?
Well, I think that just one, the sense of purpose is necessary but not sufficient. Because if you don't have that structure, then you don't have the protections. Basically, you have not created a trusting social environment. There's a sense that you need all 8, and even that's a little bit too simple. But I think there's lots of material out there. I'm talking about it all the time. I've written books. I'm now working very closely with Raj Sisodia as we speak. Where Raj and I are teaching a course at Tech Monterrey in Mexico, which is where he has his Conscious Enterprise Center. We're teaching a 5-week course. We'll probably be doing it again. The recordings will be available. So, it's like there's plenty of material out there. And I think the thing to do is just to try to appreciate that how you think about it is like very, very important. And if you're carrying this myth around with you, then you're just not seeing the world the way the world really is. And so you need to shed one set of ideas, and then you need to learn about another set and realize that it's a different set. And by the way, it's simpler than the other one, much simpler and more intuitive and commonsensical. And so just consider the fact that you need to swap out one set of ideas for another. And then this will begin to make sense for you. You might say it might give you a new common sense. And at that point, it's just a matter of practicing and learning and so on. And there's like tons of material available. Go to my organization or all the information that you might want. But first, there has to be the perspective change, because otherwise, you're just unlikely to see it. It won't make sense to you. And by the way, Bob Chapman, back to him in our podcast, he says this again and again and again. He says, David, all these business gurus come to my company and they look at what we're doing and they say, Bob, I've never seen anything like it. I've never seen anything like it. And what amuses me about that is that it's not because it doesn't exist. It's all around us. It's in just about every one of your guests, not to speak of Bob Chapman. So if somebody's never seen anything like it, it's because they can't see what's in front of their faces. That's why you need to swap out these ideas that are blinding you, preventing you from seeing this, and then swap something else back in, and then they'll be in front of your faces.
Yeah, that makes sense. Almost like you're talking about, taking off a complete wardrobe and putting on a complete new one, right? It's almost like you need a completely new personality in a way.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, in religion, you talk about being born again. What would that be but swapping out one set of ideas and swapping in another. So we could think of this, and I'm not trying to get religious on us here, but it almost is like a born again experience. If we think of that as a swap out, and we consider the need for a swap out, then I think we could regard this as a born again. I say that as a scientist.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's like a complete transformation, right? It's like, I get it, right? If you have a personality and your personality has you behave in a certain way, and then you just see the world in a certain way. But so you almost have to completely get that out of there before you can put anything new in there.
And in order to change what you do on the outside, you have to change some things on the inside. I think that's another point. I mean, it's another way of saying the same thing. And so it's in that sense that we become more loving as individuals, or we're able to express our love in a context where it's seldom expressed. How much time do we have? Because there's one other example I wanted to give, if I could, but do we have time?
I say go for it. We're going for it.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, it's another one of these convergences, and I'm not remembering the author, but it's a nuclear submarine captain who turned the worst submarine in the fleet into the best by changing his leadership model. And so this is another case of convergence. But what he ended up doing, and get this is on a nuclear submarine. So if ever there was a need for a command and control hierarchy, it's got to be this. But what he created was, he called not a leader-follower model, but a leader-leader model, in which everyone on the ship, from the top to the bottom, of course there was a strict command structure, but at every node of that structure, all the way down to the bottom level, every individual was in a sense functioning in a leadership capacity within his defined domain. And as he would put it, if somebody's in the organization just following orders, that's a waste. And so the fact that everyone in the organization functions as a leader, and the organization is structured to make that happen, I think is a perfect example of leadership the way we want it. And so Turn This Ship Around is the title of the book.
David Marquette.
David Marquette, and I think he's actually became a business consultant. So here's another example of the archipelago phenomenon, where this person, who knows how he came by it, but he did it brilliantly. And so we have much to learn, and then we can just fit that into the general framework.
Yeah, I would think if I was the submarine captain, I don't think I'd know everything about the nuclear capabilities as far as how that they technically function, that I'd be like, you know what, you're the leader in this area. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you what to do.
It's a great book. It's a great book to read.
Hey, so I want to circle back a little bit to something you said you disagreed with Chris on, was the dynamics of like the individual and the group and being able to love. And I think where Chris, when I asked him this question about love and business, I think what he was saying was really, as far as systems and things like that, seeing one as objective and one as subjective, and being like, well, you can't have a subjective thing in like the material world like that. I think that's what he was saying. I don't know if that's what you disagreed with, or if that's kind of brings you two together.
Well, I'll chat about it with Chris. But the point that I want to make is that if we define love the way anyone would define love, basically something which is just dedicated to something else, okay, dedicated to the welfare of something else. You can build a system that's dedicated to the welfare of its members.
Yeah.
And why would we not call that a loving system? And so to think that love is only a property of individuals and cannot be a property of a group, it denies the possibility that a group can become an individual. And if we're really going to talk about groups as organisms, then they must be capable of the full range that we typically discuss for flesh and blood people. That's important. And I bet Chris probably does agree with it if we were to trash it out. I'm guessing that, but I can't
Yeah.
I can't say it until
Yeah.
I talk with him more.
I mean, our Bliss acronym stands for build, love, into scalable systems. So it can kind of prompt us as humans, to live this way. Let me ask you the question I asked Chris. So what do you say to people? What do you think when people say love does not belong in business? Let me put it that way.
Well, I basically say you're mistaken, and if you think that way, it's probably because you're blinded by the wrong theory. So that would be my short answer. I beg to differ, and I've got a lot of evidence and a lot of theory behind it. So yeah, let's have that contest of ideas, and I think that I would be the winner.
All right, that's going to be part 2. That'll be part 2. We'll do that sometime. We'll circle back. Let's see, David, where can people find out more about what you're doing and your podcast, and where should they go to?
All they have to do is go to ProSocial.world is the website, and then we have an online magazine called This View of Life, and there's many articles, and all my podcasts are there on This View of Life.
David, thank you for joining us today. Like I said, this was awesome. I love this so much. I think I was smiling the whole time, but I usually have to remind myself just do that, but I'm feeling it. Thank you to our listeners too for being part of this conversation. If you're passionate about leading with purpose, building conscious organizations, and driving real change, be sure to subscribe and share this episode, and we will see you next time on the Bliss Business Podcast.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you, David.